In this country, you can say anything. There is a sudden jerk, there is an abrupt jerk in the thematic trajectory of the poem as the poem moves from its fifth section to its sixth section, from its penultimate section to its last section. The last line of the fifth section goes something like this: witness is what you must bear. And the opening line of the last section is something like this: in this country, you can say anything. It would appear that the poet has deliberately attempted, deliberately created, or attempted to create a contrast between what she sees in totalitarian societies and what she experiences in the democratic society of Canada. In this country is Canada, whose comfort, whose freedom the poet is fortunate enough to enjoy. In Canada, you can say anything. There is freedom of expression, freedom of expression. The poet is leading, by her own admission, a rather cushy life in Canada. Then why does she so passionately speak about what is happening in other countries, in faraway countries, in Africa, Central America, the Caribbean? This is because the poet believes, along with Martin Luther King, that, I quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, unquote. I repeat, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Not that Margaret Atwood is very happy with Canadian society. She says that you can say what you please, you can say what you like in Canada because no one will listen to you anyway. Not every Canadian can be a Margaret Atwood. And Margaret Atwood is unhappy, is upset about the fact that Canadians in general are in the least bothered, in the least concerned about the atrocities that take place in countries ruled by dictatorships, as long as they lead cushy lives in their democratic country. The fact is that most Canadians are not in any way interested in what is taking place in faraway countries, in the atrocities that are everyday events in countries ruled by dictators. And Margaret Atwood says that Canada is the place where you can try to write the poem that can never be written. This is a poem that can never be written in the country where it should be written. It is only in Canada you can try to write it. It is very significant that the poet uses the word try. The poet does not say that you can write this poem here because she feels that it is not a real poem. It is only the draft of a poem. It is not even the draft of a poem. It is only a set of notes towards the writing of the poem. That is why the poet says that here you can try to write, not write, but try to write the poem that can never ever be written in the country where it should be written. And this is a poem which invents nothing, which excuses nothing. These lines provide an accurate description of the poem that can never be written. A poem which does not invent anything. There is no fiction involved in it. Fictions are totally absent from the poem. The poem is grounded in reality. The poem is based in reality. What the poem speaks about is nothing but the harsh, everyday reality of a society which is totalitarian. It is also a poem which refuses to excuse anything. It is quite possible to justify violence, justify exploitation, deprivation, the denial of human rights, the denial of human rights. You can find excuses, but the poem that can never ever be written, the poem that can never be written, is a poem which refuses to either invent fictions or excuse citing reasons because you invent and excuse yourself each day. The poet here establishes a contrast between the poem which can never be written, the poem which refuses to invent fictions to justify the trampling of human rights, the poem which refuses to find excuses for the trampling of human rights wherever it takes place. Maybe in faraway countries, maybe in Africa, maybe in Central America, maybe in the Caribbean. And the life of the typical Canadian who invents and excuses himself each day. The contrast is between the poem which looks the human rights violations straight on the face, which powerfully comes to grips with the human rights violations taking place in countries ruled by dictators, and the typical Canadian, the average Canadian, who invents fictions, who invents stories, narratives, who finds excuses to psychologically insulate himself from the terrible violations of human rights taking place in other countries. The typical Canadian, from the point of view of Margaret Atwood, is thus a coward, is thus a coward who isolates and insulates himself from the happenings of the contemporary world.